Blah.
So this is pretty interesting. The legendary Tim Curry has released his memoir, Vagabond, and he talks about various aspects of playing Dr. Frank-N-Furter in the Rocky Horror Show and later the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's kind of amazing when you think about it because Tim essentially created a role that has been replicated hundreds, if not thousands of times by this point in various different avenues, from shadow casts to stage plays to official productions of the Rocky Horror Show. All of them are based on the foundation of what Tim Curry came up with. This is what's known as breaking the character, right? Or something along that level, where you, as the first person to bring a character to life, take what's on the page and project it through yourself, the instrument, and you synthesize a way a character is supposed to be played. Or you synthesize how a character should be approached. Obviously, there are variations to this, but here's what Tim Curry has to say in his brand new memoir, which everybody should go and pick up and read. It's really interesting. He says, I should really try and read this like Tim Curry as Dr. Frank-N-Furter if I can. I'm going to try and hold it. I don't think it's quite possible. Over the years, when people have asked me for advice about playing Frank, I've told them the same thing. None of the characters in the show are in drag, not even Frank. Their outfits shouldn't be viewed with such a constrictive lens. We're all wearing what people normally wear in Transylvania. Get the fuck over it. Don't perform like you're dressing in something inappropriate or transgressive. You're wearing the national attire. Tangentially, this viewpoint is by no means intended to deride true drag artists who have been major supporters of Rocky Horror. They're a community who gets it and gets on with it. I admire them very much. And plenty of drag artists have dressed up as Dr. Frank-N-Furter. But again, Frank himself is not wearing drag. In my humble opinion, putting him in that box is one of the biggest mistakes people make when they're trying to play him. I know that's terrible. That's not a good Frank-N-Furter, but I'm trying my very best. I really like trying to speak like Frank. But what's interesting is, so here's where I kind of disagree, and I'm not Richard O'Brien. I'm not Tim Curry. And I'm just a guy on the internet. What does my opinion really matter? But, I kind of see it slightly differently. He says that they're not in drag, but they're actually wearing what people normally wear in Transylvania, which is the place where the aliens come from. I don't know that I agree with that. I think the most interesting aspect of Rocky Horror, at the core of Rocky Horror, is that you have aliens who are not hindered by any of the societal or gender constructs that we have here in our society as human beings, right? They come to this place and they just wear what feels good to them. They're approaching these things, they're approaching sexuality, and they're approaching dress and how they carry themselves, not from any kind of societal expectation. And the metaphor is that they're aliens and that they are unhindered, and which is also a metaphor for how, can't speak for myself personally in this regard, but how I've heard a lot of people talk about how they feel in regards to their gender, how it can feel alien, as people have told to me. And so I find that very interesting. There's like a metaphor there in that kind of way. So it's almost like they come here and they don't look at something as like, it's like a sissy thing for a man to wear women's high heels or whatever, or a corset or whatever.
Once rehearsals began, the play took on a life of its own. Initially, we didn't care much about what the public's reaction to it would be. We knew we would be performing it in the upstairs venue, the experimental space, and we knew what that meant. Our expectations were tempered accordingly. There would be no skin off of anyone's nose if it didn't work. The upside was that there was absolutely no fucking limits, which were very liberating for us actors. It was also essential to the play's evolution and to our comfort, with leaving all inhibitions at the door. I was faithful to Richard's words and Jim's direction, but within those generous bounds, I played with different versions of Frank's character and tried out various personas. What would a 1970s variation of a mad scientist horror figure sound like? How would he carry himself? We were doing parody, yes, but I wanted to portray Frank as more than just a spoof. I wanted to give a sense of realness to this modern Frankenstein who is obsessed with image and power, even as the role calls for an air of levity, especially when it comes to scenes involving, for example, a cannibalistic feast. We tried several accents, and after we threw out the obvious German accent I had originally used, I tried a more universal Middle European vibe, but that felt trite. American wasn't right either, too brash. At one point, I was sitting on a bus behind an older woman who was talking to her friend. She belonged to a particular social group of women, generally from Knightsbridge, who tended to wear headscarves knotted under their chin. I overheard her ask, "Do you have a house in the town or a house in the country?" Without hesitation, I knew I had found Frank's trademark tone. The woman on the bus who was doing her very best to sound like the Queen. It happened to remind me of the voice my mother used on the telephone whenever she wanted to impress people.
And that's really interesting too. So when you think of Tim Curry breaking this character, he's really imbuing aspects of his mother. And if you read in this book about his relationship with his mother, it was, it was tumultuous and acrimonious at certain times in various kinds of ways. Like, she could be very cold and she did certain things. And it's interesting. Tim tries his very best to understand his mother, even though clearly there's resentment when he talks about her, which, listen, all relationships with parents can be complicated. But when we think of Frank, we need to think of Tim Curry's mother a little bit too, because that's what's coming through the role a little bit.
A few things are crucial to consider. First, he fucks everyone in the play. The audience has to believe that is precisely what he wants to do, and that he is entirely liberated to do so. It's a huge challenge, but a tremendous opportunity to throw away the barriers of sexual behavior that have been imposed on you. We all exist in a kind of photo-developing bath of sexual contradictions, and the more of them we recognize, the more fun we can have. In that way, it was necessary pleasure to explore the nature of desire as I was getting into the role. These are aliens who are all about sensual pleasure, and so they do what feels good, and they're comfortable enough in their own skin to do it, and they don't care. And I find that really sort of interesting, and that's why Rocky Horror is really at its heart, and its very, very core, is a movie of liberation. Like, don't dream it, be it. That's what that is. It's liberation. It's also super punk rock. And at the center of all this is Frank. Here's the part that really matters. This is the secret to the essence of Frank-N-Furter, according to Tim Curry. Second, actors must remember that their task is to embody the character they're playing. It's not about them, and they need to get out of the way as much as possible so that Frank's distinct desires can shine through authentically. And finally, the audience may perceive Frank to be like a woman, but he doesn't behave like one. He is a very strong, aggressive man. He shouldn't camp around. In other words, If you're going to attempt to truly enter the character, wear your high heels like a man.
And it's so true about Frank. And what he's saying here is there's a fluidity to Frank, but at the end of the day, Frank is a man wearing high heels. And what's particularly interesting, he says, in other words, if you're going to attempt to truly enter the character, wear your high heels like a man. So it doesn't matter who you are as a person, however you identify within the very fluid spectrum of gender, right? Like whatever that is for you, wherever you sit, it's just important that you approach it as a man, a confident man wearing high heels. And I think that's interesting. And obviously, I think maybe even depending on your gender and like where you sit, that's obviously going to flavor that approach as well, if you're choosing to approach it the way that Tim Curry approached Frank. So there's two actors who I think could have also played Frank in really interesting ways. Again, nothing that could ever surpass Tim Curry, who will always be Frank. Like there's no other Frank but Tim Curry. But I really think that Oliver Reed and Vincent Price both could have done very interesting versions of Frank, especially Oliver Reed, who talk about masculine energy. That would be really interesting. Although I think that there would have been a little bit more feminine energy in Vincent Price doing the role. And of course, Vincent Price would have his mustache. All right, so be honest. What did you think of my impression reading Tim Curry's memoir in a pseudo Frank impression? I did my very best. I did it with actually, really what I was trying to do, I guess, I always think of that scene when he's talking to Dr. Scott. That's like the only way I can do it. That's the only way in through that. Otherwise, it doesn't happen.